Chris Hensley is a registered representative of Cambridge Investment Research, Inc., a broker-dealer member of FINRA SIPC, investment advisor representative of Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, Inc., a registered investment advisor. Cambridge and Houston First Financial Group are not affiliated.
The Houston Midtown chapter of the Society for Financial Awareness presents Money Matters with your host, Christopher Hensley.
Good morning, everybody. You're listening to Money Matters on KPFT Houston. I'm Chris Hensley. The time is now 11 a.m. and we have a great show lined up for you today. According to a study conducted by creative agency DNA Seattle that surveyed 2,000 Americans, 54% of respondents agree on some level that brands should help build common ground and avoid taking sides. Additionally, more than half of at least somewhat agree that too many brands use societal issues as a marketing ploy to sell their product or services. We are going to do a deep dive today into a study put out by DNA Seattle talking about politics and causes when it comes to marketing for businesses. So please stay tuned. Keep listening. We'll do a deep dive with our guest, Christine Wise, today. But if you are a long-time listener, you know we always reserve just the first few moments of the show to tell you a little bit about what's going on in the Houston and the Gulf Coast area when it comes to financial literacy. So we are, if you're a longtime listener, you always hear me talk about Houston Money Week as I'm a member of the leadership team. We did have both a leadership team meeting this week and then also a partners meeting. It was our second partners meeting for Houston Money Week 2020, which will take place in April of next year. So you might ask, well, why are you guys meeting so early for that? Well, the reason for that is that each and every year, Houston's version of Financial Literacy Month is called Houston Money Week. We're several years into having this citywide initiative, and we'll have meetings ramping up until we get to that day or to that week of Financial Literacy Week. You'll hear me go back and forth between Financial Month and Financial Literacy Week because what started out as a week here in Houston turned into an entire month of many, many different groups and organizations working together to help bring free financial literacy workshops to the Houston and the Gulf Coast area. And so we have partners that are nonprofits, we've got for-profits, we've got the banks doing community reinvestment or getting CRA credit, we've got city government, we've got some participation from universities, middle schools, high schools. Almost all of Houston education on some level has participated either this year or in the past when it comes to Houston Money Week. I encourage you to find out a little bit more by going to houstonmoneyweek.org. This is a dynamic website. There's going to be a calendar on there that's going to have all of the different events that take place locally. A lot of our nonprofit partners, though, are in this space year-round. And so if you're looking for some kind of financial literacy workshop or seminar, you can go to that website and it's going to show as those events come online. I know as we get into April, you can put even as specific as your zip code, filter it down to what's in my area that's going to be coming up for that. Or if you wanted to look at something like college education funding or tax preparation, I know a lot of the VITA sites are going to be listed on there as well that will help you do free tax preparation for low to moderate income. With that, so let's go ahead and get our guest on the line here. Christine, are you there?
I am here. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'd like to, usually I'll introduce the guest right at the beginning, but I'd like you to kind of do that for me here. Tell me a little bit about yourself professionally, but then also maybe something that listeners might not know to get to know you a little bit better.
Absolutely. So my name is Christine Wise, and I am the Chief Strategy Officer at an independent marketing and creative agency headquartered in Seattle, Washington, and the agency's name is DNA Seattle. I have been part of this agency for a while now, and my role at the agency is to kind of serve as that partner to our clients and also internally at the agency around the strategies that we should be using to drive the business outcomes that our clients are looking for. And I have a team of people that do all sorts of things, from deep data strategy to what's called engagement strategy and even brand strategy. So I run that team, and that's kind of my professional role. And as part of that, one of the things that we do, my team does, is a lot of thought leadership. And obviously, I think everyone's heard that expression, hindsight is 20/20. And based on the coming election year, we thought it would be interesting to conduct a study called Foresight is 20/20, which is really about how do you understand where things are going in particular during this upcoming election cycle, and how can we learn some important insights that we could use to both guide our internal clients, our agency clients, but also the business community at whole, to be more effective as marketers during the coming year, likely beyond. Some of the stuff we learned we think is more lasting than just this election cycle. So, and I can continue to tell you more about that and other stuff about me. I'm a long time, born and raised in the Midwest and ended up on the West Coast somehow and have stayed on the West Coast. And I have two children, a 17-year-old and a 14-year-old, and we're even debating the cost of college education. So in terms of the finance, I heard you just talking about that in the introduction. I think that's near and dear to my heart right now. So.
Oh, yeah. How old are your kids?
17. So I have a junior in high school and a freshman. And
okay.
Just getting kind of drinking from a fire hose in terms of understanding, the cost of education. And it's actually one of the things we looked at in the study in terms of financial things that people are worried about. One of them is the rising cost of education, which was some interesting data around that for sure.
So you're right there where you're kind of looking because you've got kids in that age group there. So
yes, it's very relevant.
Well, let's talk about this study, because we've had a couple of shows on in the past where we have had companies on that would make an argument that we vote with our dollars and that we should be very conscious of what companies are doing. And so one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is because this is surprisingly kind of contrarian to that.
Yeah.
As you did this study and rolled it out, tell us some of the things that came up.
Yeah, great question. And one of the things that's interesting, and I think part of why we did this study is because the brands and companies that are getting a lot of press and attention for what I'm calling corporate political advocacy. So, you have corporate social responsibility, and then increasingly we're seeing a trend called corporate political advocacy. And a lot of the brands that are getting, you'll see examples of brands really kind of going out on a limb, and sometimes it really works for them, and sometimes it really doesn't. And we're starting to feel like brands were being presented with two choices: either sit on the sidelines in terms of having a point of view about issues in the world, or go out on a limb. And so we were curious about whether or not there's another playbook that companies and businesses could use that may be as relevant and potentially even more effective. And so what we conducted in the study is we looked at all the issues people care about, or all the issues of the day, a huge list of issues, and we asked people how important are those issues and how polarizing are they. And then the other thing we looked at is values. What values are important to you and how under threat they are. And the last piece we looked at was, what do you want from businesses today in terms of, what you think they should be doing? And what was surprising to us is that because one of the number one issues of the day is our state of divisiveness as a country, more people by far wanted brands to just build common ground than they did want brands to kind of go out on the limb and stir the pot. I think people are really feeling, according to the data in our study, the country is feeling quite divided. And there seems to be a real opportunity for brands to kind of be the change we want to see. In other words, kind of help forge that common ground and bring people together and be a unifying source. And we think that's rooted in values. So talk about values more so than just issues.
So you made a couple of really big distinctions there, because we have had shows in the past about the corporate social responsibility, and one of the things you're talking about is this is kind of a divergence from this, because it's corporate political advocacy. So it's not just about social responsibility; it's another version of it, another flavor, another brand. Where they're actually going out on a limb as opposed to sitting on the sidelines and taking some kind of stance on something. But the negative side of that is the divisiveness. You did this study about what's most important. You also ask about the values, and when it comes to building common ground, leading with the values as opposed to something that's going to lead to divisiveness. What else can you tell us about this?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things, for instance, just as a single data point that I think it would be great for your listeners to think about, is that 69% of people in our country, in our survey, have a lot of fear that the election year is going to further divide and polarize our country. And they're already, I mean, we're not even into 2020 yet, and they're already, 57% of them are already sick of hearing about politics, had some level of agreement. So you can imagine if a brand is going to talk about, the change they want to make, to do it based in values. And let me give you an example of that. So, so we represent some of the largest credit unions in the country. Two of our clients, one is Golden One Credit Union in Sacramento, and another is the ECU here in Seattle, in the Washington state. And one of the things we've been looking at is, for instance, credit unions tend to be very inclusive and organizations that welcome all sorts of people and really are committed to helping their members' financial health. You don't need to have a political stance to advocate for that, but you could see how it could become something. You could talk about, the 99%. You could talk about tax. You could make an argument that becomes very political really quickly. And so what we've been talking about and championing is being more about fairness and responsibility and compassion and, community. And those are values that transcend political affiliation. They tend to transcend demographic or generational breaks. And so that's been a really important part for us, is really looking at what are the values that are true that are most commonly held by Americans, despite their political affiliations, their generation, and all those things.
So one of the statements in the study is personal issues remain more pressing than political issues. Can you go a little bit deeper with that?
Yeah, that was fascinating. So, again, I think anyone who's following the news it's easy to get in your own echo chamber and believe that everyone is talking about politics 24/7 because that's all we're hearing. But we asked, one of the questions in the study was literally, what are your top priorities for the rest of 2019 and looking ahead into 2020? And the number one priority was improving your physical health, and number two priority was improving your finances.
Wow,
the bottom two priorities, so at the very bottom, significantly less important, were contributing to or helping, contributing to either remove or preserve the current political leadership. So in terms of acting like political advocates and really getting out there, that was much less important to people than the more personal priorities of their health, their money, their personal relationships, trying to get balance, all of those things.
So I'm a big advocate for financial health as well as physical health. So that's hitting a chord with me there. So number one, the physical health and fitness, and then personal finances number two. When you did this study, did you find any differences with age? Because I know you guys went really deep with the data.
Yeah, we did. We did find differences in age, and what was interesting is some of the issues that shift based on generation. So one example of that would be environment. environmental, like preserving the environment as an issue, and I think we're seeing it now in the news. That issue was more important and more polarized, or seen as more polarizing among younger generations than it was among older generations. Issues such as diversity, some of those, we had systemic racism, diversity, some of those issues also popped more for younger people. But we were also quite surprised by some of the universality of things, and one of the ones that was the most universal issue was this dislike for our political divisiveness and division, which is kind of where we were like, oh, that's an aha, right? If you're given all these issues from immigration to gun control to affordable health care and all of these issues, and one of the top ones, regardless of generation, gender, anything, was political division, that made us feel like we were kind of cluing into that thing I was discussing earlier, which is that people are really tired of feeling less united as a country.
Now, let's pivot for a moment and come at it from the business owner or the entrepreneurial side of it. When a business owner or company thinks about their employees, how does this play into that?
Oh, yeah, great question. Yeah, one of the things that we are cautioning our clients to do is, if you are going to be kind of treading into that corporate political advocacy zone, you need to look at your employees as your first customers and make sure that you're being respectful of their values and beliefs, so that you don't end up, with people wanting to leave your company because you're really championing values that feel, or not values so much, but issues that feel really disconnected to their own personal values. So we think internal employees are the most important first stakeholder, if you will.
So that's important to know, because there's certain they're, say, politically agnostic. At some point, there was a point where people's politics didn't necessarily come up, and now if we're thinking about people diving into the first area that we talked about, the corporate social responsibility, or even where they're taking more of a stand politically across the board for the company, well, then you might be isolating some of your best resources, your employees,
and silencing them. I mean, I think that absolutely, Chris, you're right on there. I mean, I think people don't want to feel marginalized at work, and or creating an environment where people can talk about, come together and celebrate the positive values that are uniting us, things like open-mindedness or fairness, responsibility, as opposed to bringing people together on political issues or trying to do that. And I also think it really depends. There are probably some companies where it would be fine, if your company is extreme. Like, for instance, one of the things we saw is that when brands and their employees are extremely liberal, urban-based, and younger, that tolerance for political advocacy, not only tolerance, that response to political advocacy was higher than it is if your brand is more mainstream or your services are more general.
So it's something, as a business owner, you have to take consideration of your audience, who you're serving, and that even is your employees as well. You have to keep that into mind.
And be authentic. I mean, one of the things that you talked about earlier is that stat we had about using societal issues as a marketing ploy. And I think, consumers are increasingly marketing savvy, right? And it's sometimes very easy and it's very easy now with the internet to go, oh, you're talking about this thing. Well, what are your practices? Right. You're talking about the environment. How green is your company? And so, or you're talking about gender equality. How many women are on your board? So it's very easy now for consumers to do their due diligence, if you will, and follow up and look at how authentic a position is. So we use an example like Patagonia, a great brand, right? They're going out on a limb on some of their political advocacy work, but it's quite authentic to them. And if you look through their history, it's a big part of who that brand has been, and it's part of why the employees who work there are attracted to them. So it's working for them when they kind of do that. It wouldn't work for all brands.
Definitely. I hear the point when you say authentic, and this is a company where it's working, but you might look back at some of these companies that don't have necessarily great track records and say, well, you're doing this, but
yes.
You've done this in the past, or XYZ, so I can see where let's talk about the research methodology, because I know when we do deep dives into data, it's interesting to see kind of how all that was put together. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this actual project involved multiple types of research, and some of the data points I'm quoting is from a nationally representative survey of 2,000 adults 18 plus. So we focus on 18 plus because we were really interested in the voting, kind of the voting segment, even though obviously there's a lot of young adults, young teenagers, and that we're seeing become extremely important as political advocates in our country. But we did focus on 18 plus, and it's what's called a nationally representative sample, which means we took into consideration when we pulled the sample the composition of the country. So geographically, the participants, the 2,000, spread out geographically in representative ways. We did the same thing with both generation and gender, as well as income. And then you kind of make sure that you're not just hearing from one segment of the population, which I think is one of the challenges sometimes with research. You see data points and you don't always know what the sample was. And so our goal was to make sure that the sample was really, truly representative. The other thing we did is we have a source that some businesses that your listeners are part of probably have called social data intelligence. And this is a piece of software that lets you listen to all of the conversations happening online daily, so like 13 billion sound bites a day, and you can analyze it by different subject topics. And so we were able to add that as another layer on the study.
Wow, so I'm writing that down. I've never actually heard of that. Social data intelligence?
Yes, and we use a service called, we subscribe to a software called NetBase. Mm-hmm. They're a great partner of ours, and we love them. And NetBase is a piece of, is the software that pulls all that data in. And then, like anything, it's all in the art of the analyst. And we have a super strong, head of social data intelligence practice here at DNA. And he is a wizard in terms of going in and finding the true nuggets in the data. Yeah.
I love it. So if you're joining us or listening, tuning in, we're talking to Christina Wise, and we were talking about a national study that was done recently. And the company is Seattle DNA, is that right? Or DNA?
Yeah, DNA Seattle, either one, yeah.
So for listeners who want to find out more about this, what's the easiest way for them to do that?
Yeah, so they could absolutely go to DNA's website, which is dnaseattle.com. And we are also going to be pushing out through some of our social channels infographics on a weekly basis with some of the data points. But if you go to dnaseattle.com, if you're a business owner and are interested in understanding more how some of these topics we're discussing could impact your company, shoot us a line, and we'd love to talk to you, because the study is so vast. There's so many data points, and really we can kind of comb through that and provide, I think, insights regardless of what your business is, and dig in and guide you. So yeah, hopefully 2020 will be more positive than some anticipate it will be.
Well, I know. So going back to the divisiveness part that we talked about, with that, what other ways would you talk, or what other ways could marketers take that information and use it, knowing that there's that sense of divisiveness right now preceding the 2020 election?
Yeah, I mean, I think just the idea of either bringing people together, allowing, and also then focusing on people's personal priorities. Mm-hmm. I mean, in other words, helping people address their financial health, helping people address their physical health, even helping advocate for that. There's a huge interaction between financial health and physical health, right? They're highly correlated. And so even trying to find partnerships, if you're a financial, oriented company, find a partnership that has to do with healthcare. And the more brands can show that they can come together and partner, the more people feel that. And, that's kind of all back to that whole, building common ground, being the change we want to see. That's, I think, a real strong way to build affinity in 2020.
I love that. So if you've thought about having partnerships with healthcare companies and I'm talking from a financial advisor perspective.
Yeah.
And we think about stress, the stress that's related with your finances, that could be a good fit. But even more so in a year where this fear is there and that divisiveness, the idea of partnering and finding common ground and should bubble up to the top. It should be one of the things that you could take away from this study. What other things do you want to tell us? We've got just about 5 minutes left. What have I forgot to ask you that you want listeners to know?
Well, I think it's not so much you. I think you did a great job in asking me questions. I guess what I would say is that, I think we're seeing, one of our questions in the study was about digging into people's self-described political affiliations. And what was interesting to us is that only 8% of people describe themselves as extremely liberal, and only 9% of people describe themselves as extremely conservative. And then you have people who are conservative, 37% self-describe themselves as conservative, 35% liberal, and 29% is independent. So you really almost have, even groups there, plus or minus a little bit. And I think the one, maybe thing I would say is that I feel like a lot of the news coverage that we're seeing and a lot of the information that brands are kind of reacting to has to do with the smaller group, the 9% extremely on one side, 9% extremely on the other, which I think is that false belief that everyone wants to put up their dukes and fight. Mm-hmm. And yes, this is an important election year, but I think the fact that 29% of people are independent today, claim themselves as independent. The fact that only 24% of all people believe that they describe themselves as politically active, like really hardcore. Mm-hmm. 84% of people are, really begging for this common ground. And so to me, the data is clear that there is this big opportunity to connect on values. And without getting into all the deep dives of different ways for values to show up by generation and all those things, I will tell you some of the values that are most important universally, and this might be great, and some I think are highly related to finance, is privacy. Privacy is a value that people feel is extremely important and under threat. And how might that, knowing that there's so much sensitivity around privacy, how might that interact, or how might that inform how a financial advisor interacts, for example, with one of their customers? Fairness, independence, open-mindedness, honesty, those are also values, and I think I said independence, but independence, these are all some of the values that fall into that quadrant of most important and most under threat by kind of universally. So I think keeping those values in mind and feeling like if you want to connect with people, you could root it in the values, and that might be a really effective roadmap for marketing.
I love it. So you mentioned quite a bit right there. We talked about as kind of people's self-described political affiliations, where right now it always happens in an election year where we start feeling more polarized. Even if it's not the case, it just that you mentioned the echo chamber earlier. You can feel it. It just starts building up each and every election year. And so if we sidestep and we look at, outside of that polarizing, it's actually a larger number that people that don't necessarily take a stance or are independent, but we look at these bigger values, the universal values. We talked about privacy, we talked about fairness, being independent, open-minded. All of those things are going to be universal, really, and they will help point us back to that common ground, take us away from that polar division there. Christine, I want to thank you for being on the show. We're right here at the end of the show. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Money Matters Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, visit us on the web at www.moneymatterspodcast.com. drop us a line on SpeakPipe on the right-hand corner. It will receive any voicemails, questions, thoughts, concerns that you have about the show. In addition to this, we recently launched a Patreon campaign. Click on the Donate Now tab to hit the tip jar and find out what Patreon's campaign is all about.